Everyone, Doc T here with another weekly podcast from the Horses Advocate. TheHorseAdvocate.com is a website everyone can go to dig in deeper, to gain access to me on an individual basis. Once a month, we have forums. Once a month, we have a Zoom meeting where we get together and discuss one topic, and people can ask me questions. The forums are a place where I spend my time to answer everybody's question and really dig into some of these topics. And all we're trying to do is help horses thrive in a human world, and we're trying to fill in the blanks of the missing horse owner's manual so people in the future, our children, their children, will have access to this information that is not jaded by agendas from other people. That'll go on to the pathological science, which someday I'll put together a whole blog on, but I find fascinating. But today I'm going to take another question that I got from the Facebook group. And it's about a person who's an endurance rider. And this endurance rider was all on board with the no grain challenge, and she understands that, and it's really good. But her question was, what do I do with my horse that's going to be competing? It's going to be running 50 miles or 100 miles over a 2-day course in competitive trail or endurance, either one. Both very strenuous exercises for a horse that basically leads a sedentary life confined to a pen, a pasture, or a stall. And I always think back in the days before humans, where these horses would migrate over, land masses the size of the United States, from the south in the winter to the north in the summer, to get new access to different forages and different food. And how they have to sometimes run from wild predators, and how they had to really work hard. And then humans got a hold of them and said, you know what, you're going to do this, but carry us on your back, and we're going to gallop into battle and away from battle from stronger enemies. And you know what, we're going to also hook you up to wagons and cannons, and we're going to haul you over mountains into other battles that we're waging. And you really want to see a horse work? Let's look back then, when if you wanted to run into town to have lunch, you didn't hop in your car, turn the key, and hit the gas or accelerator. Notice my electric car reference there. It's not a gas pedal, it's an accelerator. But we hooked up our team or our single horse, and we made it trot the whole way. I see my dog, it runs everywhere. That dog uses up so much energy and doesn't have an ounce of fat on her. Yet you and I leave pretty much sedentary lives. I know we work our tails off in the barn, mucking stalls, going out to paddocks and doing all this. And we're much more fit than somebody who just drives to the office and sits in a cubicle all day and then drives home and drinks beer and watches football, eating pizza. And this is why everyone says exercise is more important. But we're taking a horse and that's hopefully well trained. And that training is going to allow the horse to run its tail off, either at a certain rate or at a fast rate, and do 50 to 100 miles in a competitive race, trying to come in first. And that certainly is a lot more exercise and stress than almost any other horse out there. Race horses every day go out there and gallop and build up their muscle, their capacities. And then on one day, every 2, 3, 4 weeks, it goes out and races against other horses, against a clock. And if it comes in first, it can earn money or it can earn prestige, and both in recurring stallion fees in the future. So there's a lot of reasons to keep your horse healthy and happy and running and competing, because we all want the blue ribbon. We all want to win, whether there's a monetary prize or just pride in what you do. We still want a horse to win. We don't want them to break down, and we want to make sure that they're fueled right to do that race, so they don't run out of energy at the end. They're going to be the fastest horse. And this is where nutrition and exercise seems to conflict. How many times have we seen stories of humans who are fed big meals before a race or the night before, or starve themselves and then just eat nothing but sugar? Or, there's all sorts of fads and things that seem to work, and people tend to do them, hoping that they get the best out of them. They go at 100% efficiency. And one of the things that they've discovered erroneously is that if they feed horses grains are basically starch, which is basically glucose, that they end up having enough energy to continue doing what they're doing. This started back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when all the humans left the cities, left the country and moved to the cities where they didn't have any little plot of land or any acreage where they could harvest wheat and other things. And they still wanted their breads and pastas and everything else that came from the garden. So they started to create this economy that farmers could make, that they could provide for these city people. And so farming became very important. Agriculture became very important. And our world divided into agriculture, non-agricultural groups. Now, agriculture, all they had was land and horses or oxen. And that's all they had. Donkeys, of course, mules. But they didn't have tractors. And so they had to work these animals to harvest, to plow the fields, to cultivate, to harvest, to bring the crop in and store and package, and then take all these things all the way to the distribution center. And then from there, all the way to the cities to help distribute all the grains that we were basically living on for the past 8,000 years, because grains were easily grown. They're in one spot. They can be harvested efficiently. They can be stored in silos for long periods of time. And then those stores can be brought to the baker or the food manufacturer and turned into some sort of food that is appealing and appetizing to people who are living in cities, who don't know where a cracker comes from or a cereal comes from. They just know that it's sugar frosted, or it's got some salt sprinkled on it, or it's got a texture that we love, and we slice some cheese and put on the cracker and we consume it or we eat our sandwiches. These are all modes of efficiency to feed humans, which has led to increased disease in humans. But seeing that this is a podcast about horses, it's also led to a lot of diseases in horses. Why? Because these horses were coming in tired. They were using up all their body fat. They were looking really poorly. So the millers are the people who milled the grains, who went out and grew and harvested the grains. They would end up giving the foods, the grain that they're harvesting, back to the horses, because they said it's a plant, it's something, it's got some sugar in it, and it's going to help keep fat on my horse's bones, which it does beautifully. We all know that grain adds fat, body fat, and we know that because of the sugar is converted into body fat. So then we started racing horses, and we thought that we needed to give them a little bit more energy. So we started feeding them grain. So we started our work animals, followed by our race horse animals. And then by the 1960s, when the city life was becoming more efficient and we started to get more leisure time, and I know most of you listening to this podcast don't even know about the 1960s, but we were being promised as a nation that we would reduce the amount of hours we work in a week. We would go from our 60 to 40 to 30 to 20 hours a week, and we'd have all this leisure time, and we could do all these things that involved, no work at all, and we could go out and do them, one of which was riding and competing. So horse shows started to really dig in. We have the ancient what's the show in Madison Square Garden? I guess it's called Madison Square, the National Horse Show. And then we have all these other horse shows that came along, maybe late 1800s, early 1900s, and certainly by the mid 1900s, 1950 on, they became more and more popular. And we had trucks delivering our horses to horse shows. I know because I work for Morrissey's Horse Pullmans out of Pauling, New York, and they got their start in the 60s. And nobody else was hauling horses back then. I worked for them in the 70s, and I used to go to horse shows all the time with a semi filled with anywhere from 8 to 16 horses packed back there going to horse shows on a weekend. They would show and then we'd haul them back because nobody was hauling horses in their own horse trailers, because back then in the 70s, it was illegal to do that. Yes, it was illegal to haul somebody's horses to the horse show and you accept money. So nobody had a horse trailer. Nobody had pickup trucks that could effectively pull a horse trailer back in the 70s. The viewpoint I have from history is fascinating. And here you are, you're getting these beautiful new trucks and truck and trailer combinations to haul your horses across the country in luxury. And this is 2021. So you're going back 40 years, 50 years, and we didn't have this. This is just all brand new. So the whole idea about competitive horses is new. Back in World War I, we were using horses to haul cannons over battlefields up mountains to put it in place. Hannibal, was it Hannibal? Who was it? Who employed elephants to pull armor over the mountains in South Asia. I've got my metaphors all mixed up, but somebody used elephants to pull things. I mean, they still use elephants as beasts of burden in many places. We use these four-legged beasts that have more muscle capacity than we have to do the jobs that machines couldn't do. They weren't even invented yet. So we have to understand that this idea of doing a 50 or 100 mile endurance race is not every day. This isn't like, oh my gosh, we're going to waste our horse away doing 100 miles every day. Even the Pony Express that would do long distances, those horses were rested. And then the question that the person has is, let's say you do a Pony Express pony, or you're doing something that's extremely exertional, in this case, a 50 or 100 mile ride, or a standardbred or thoroughbred who's racing for their life to go as fast as they can, anywhere from, a quarter mile to almost 2 miles. Every one of them has certain needs and requirements. And the question is basically, how do you feed these animals? Well, I'm gonna rely on the principles that I've set forward and say that the principles are principles because they're principles. They're foundations. These are things that are irrefutable, that we can't get away from. And some of those things are, one, your muscles prefer fat for fuel, not sugar. That is one of the underlying statements that has to be made. Another foundation is that the mitochondria, which are the furnaces inside the muscle cells that are working, these are the furnaces that take the fuel and convert it into energy, and the sparking energy that allows the cell to continue to live and to thrive under the conditions it has, needs two things. One, it needs fuel, and the fuels that they prefer are fat, followed by sugar, glucose. And then there's some other fuels that they'll dig into, which are neither one of those, that are very expensive to run and have serious drawbacks, but will be used if they have to. And that's when they go into anaerobic metabolism, where they don't have oxygen anymore to burn glucose or fats. So they start burning fuels that don't require oxygen. And that's called anaerobic energy production. And those things are available for a very, very short time. All right, lactate is a good one. And then another thing is the training that has to go in to condition every cell and every fuel making, energy making component, the mitochondria, how we can get that cell functioning at its efficiency. So when it is stressed this way, it can not only has an abundant fuel supply, but it can keep moving. And this is a multifactorial thing that I'm going to try and squeeze down into a podcast. But I think the principles are still the same. A horse prefers fat for fuel. So you have to have a good flow of fat going into the system. And that flow of fat has to be uninhibited so the fat can get to the cell and be used. Two, it has to have a secondary supply of glucose ready, on the ready, completely filled and ready to go. And that's going to require something called mitochondrial flexibility. that means that the mitochondria can flex between using fat or using sugar and go back and forth easily without saying, oh God, I've been using this for so long, I don't know how to do that. And that's what inflexibility is. And this is where a lot of people and horses break down because they can't switch back and forth. And that comes from not only conditioning and training, but conditioning in the way you feed a horse. There's a couple other principles that are just flittering in and out of my mind right now as I speak, because those two principles that I mentioned are the most important. So let's take a look at this. Here we have a horse that is just sitting out in a pasture doing nothing. It's a pasture ornament, a lawn ornament, as they're called. What kind of foods does that horse need? Well, he needs pasture because that's what nature meant for them to eat. And if the pasture is getting to the point where they can't maintain their weight, you have no pasture, you have to feed last summer's pasture in the form of hay. So hay was made last summer. It was put into bales, so it's preserved and stacked and stored to be brought out in the winter when the horse is really starting to lose body fat because he's burning the body fat to maintain life. And you add the hay to it to keep them healthy. That's the purpose of hay. Hay is not to be fed every day. Hay's there to add body fat to the horse that is not getting enough food, is basically starving otherwise. Remember, back in the 50s and before, we didn't have tractors and we didn't have baling machines that were universal and everyone was around. Everybody had them. Certain farmers did have them. They created stockpiles of hay and they sold those hay as a commodity. But most people just still had pastures to turn their horse out in. They didn't have these baling machines. So that, again, is a new man-made concept from the 50s and certainly the 60s and 70s. We would get tractor trailer loads of hay in the 70s, and a lot of it was dusty and moldy and just bad hay. And the lady I worked for could buy the best hay in the world. We didn't have it shipped in from Western Canada. There's no such thing as, Western hay. It just didn't exist because we didn't have the trains, we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have all the interstates made. So these are still all new man-made. And now today, down in South Florida at the showgrounds in Wellington, you can buy hay from anywhere in the country, anywhere in the continent of North America, and have it stored and tested, and you're going to pay a big price for that bale of hay. But that's still relatively new. So we have to understand that. So your pasture ornament just needs some grass and maybe some hay to keep going, and they'll be fine. Throw in some amino acids that they're not getting from the pasture, or not getting from the hay, and they're going to look just fabulous. Everything's fine. Water and salt, and boom, you're done. Now you're going to have the trail riding horse, the horse that's going to go out every weekend and do a trail ride. And we get all worried that he's going to be working, he's going to be climbing mountains, he's going to be doing 10, maybe 20 miles, an overnight camp, 10 miles out, 10 miles back, going up some steep hills and stuff. Well, from a nutritional point of view, I'll probably guarantee that it's a lot easier to do that trip without carrying sacks of grain with you. So just from a logistical point of view, being no grain is really helpful. But what does a horse actually need? Well, as the horse does that work, as long as you keep it at a walk, he's going to still burn through the fat. And the fat is going to come from the forage you're going to give him, which is basically you're going to stop and let him graze. So he's going to get that from the pasture that you've got him staked out to, you put your pen up around. So he's going to get that, and he's going to refuel himself overnight using the cellulose, which turns into fat, which is what they need. He's also going to take the glucose in the form of starch, and he's going to rejuvenate all the glycogen stores. Remember, glycogen is how all animals store glucose that they need for that emergency use. So they're going to fill up, they're going to get the glycogen, and they're going to get the cellulose that's going to be turned into short-chain fatty acids. It's going to give them the fat. And any excess glucose that they get from their forage is going to be converted into body fat and stored for future use. So that horse who goes 10 miles out and then 10 miles back is going to be using fat for fuel. Any excess glucose that he gets is going to be either stored as glycogen, or it's going to be put back as body fat. And if they need it, they'll use it. So by the end of the weekend, the horse comes back and he really doesn't look any worse for wear. That's the mechanics that are going on behind that. Hopefully, in the 5 days during the weekday, you get the horse out training so he's building muscle. Because when you build muscle, you build more glycogen storage depots, which is so beneficial to any horse that's exercising. The more places you can store glucose, the less chance you're going to have glucose turn into fat, and the less chance you're going to have insulin resistance, and the more chance that you're going to have the glucose ready to be used for those emergency situations or those hard times where you have to, gallop as fast as you can up a long incline, where they're going to be digging in, the heart rate's going to get up, and they're going to say, okay, I can't burn fat fast enough. Let me add some sugar to it. Your mitochondria are going to be flexible. So they're going to say, okay, we're using fat, but we can also use the sugar over here, and we're burning both. So by the end of the training, they're ready for the competition. And this is the secret behind endurance and race horses and any other horse that's being used for a sport, where they're going to exert themselves, where their heart rate is going to get up into the near anaerobic range, in the high aerobic range, what they call VO2 max. And once they get up there, they're going to do a lot of physiological changes. Number one, they're going to be converting both fuel and fuel sources from fat and sugar. They're going to be using them both, and that's its flexibility. If you're constantly feeding your sugar to the horse and the sugar is just constantly being drained in there, and the horse has to burn whatever excess sugar is in the cell all the time, it's not going to be able to switch back to fat as easily as if it was in fat and going back and forth between the two. It's like an electric motor that can run both alternating current and direct current. And if you get a motor that can switch back and forth, that's beneficial. So when the lights go off, you can switch over to battery supply and it's still running. And then when the lights, electricity, the power shortage is restored, it can go back to alternating current. It can go back and forth. It just automatically switches. That's mitochondrial flexibility. But if it doesn't have that flexibility, it stalls. It says, oh, my fuel source is gone. What do I do with this other fuel? I see it over here, but I'm really not adept to using it. And that's inflexibility. So we don't want that. That comes from training, and that comes from really good application of these principles of feeding. So we've got a horse that's going to be using a lot of energy, and you want it to go back and forth. You also want the glycogen stores, that's the glucose that's stored within the cells of the muscle, to be ready to go. And you also have it stored in the liver so the brain keeps functioning, because the brain doesn't really care if it's sitting out there in a pasture or it's running for its life. The brain has to work, and the best fuel for the brain, not the best, but the most abundant and easy to use fuel for the brain is glucose. That's why we have glycogen stores in our liver. So if the brain needs some glucose instantly, the liver can release it. It goes right up into the brain. Boom, you have brain function. So you remember to breathe and pump your heart, because if it doesn't have glucose, the brain cells die and you basically die yourself. So glucose is important for brain function. It also prefers or would love to run on ketones. Ketones are a much more efficient fat, and ketones can get across the blood-brain barrier. So can glucose without insulin. It can go across the blood-brain barrier. So that's kind of interesting little thing. But glucose to get to the muscle cell needs insulin, with an exception. When you get the VO2 max up to about 65% of VO2 max, which means you're really pumping your heart, you're not in anaerobic exercise yet, where you're working so hard that you don't have a chance to breathe enough oxygen in to get it to the cells. It'll start to let glucose in a back door through a different transport mechanism into your muscle cells. So that's really good. That's why exercise at beyond 65% VO2 max in humans can actually be another way to dispose of any excess glucose in your body. It can be thrown into the furnace in the cells and burned, because your body is actually needing that extra sugar in a rapid sort of fashion to stay alive, to continue running away from the tiger that's about to take you down and eat you. So here you have a horse that's out there working really hard. And I know that you have a pace you've got to keep. You've got hills, you've got obstacles. The horse is constantly thinking. So it's constantly using glucose into the brain. So it needs a ton of glucose there. And its muscles are moving really rapidly. But as long as the heart rate stays relatively low, it's going to continue to use fat. Now, I don't know what VO2 max is in a horse. I really don't. I'm sure somebody's worked it out. I haven't seen it. I'm sure somebody can comment on it in the Horses Advocate forums and let me know. But in humans, they have ruled basically that if you take the number 180 and you subtract your age, that number that's left there is your VO2 max. And if you go at 65% of that, that means your muscles are going to start converting over to let glucose in the back door. So let's say 180 and you're 50 years old. So VO2 max for you would be 130. And then 65% of 130 is, I don't know, 90. I don't know. I guess I could use my calculator someplace. So as soon as your heart rate gets above 90, you're starting to allow glucose in the back door, and you're starting to use both glucose and fat, and you're flexing between the two. And if you take your heart rate up to beyond VO2 max, in this case 130, you're going to start going in, encroaching in on the anaerobic exercise, and then it's going to use lactate. It's going to use other fuels to burn without oxygen, which isn't the best thing you can do. But when it comes to running from the tiger, it's the place to go. So anaerobic exercise, yeah, you can do it, but just touch it. Don't stay there. Stay in your VO2 max and under VO2 max, above 65%, and you'll do the best for exercise. But in the horses, I'm sure it's the same. So you need to condition your horse so the mitochondria become flexible so they can use both the fat and the sugar, the glucose that's in the cell, and then go back and forth. So here's a horse that's going on a 100-mile ride, and that's usually over 2 days. Not always, but I'm sure they're mandatory rest stops. And the question is, do I feed my horse grain to get him through these things? And I'm pretty much unequivocally going to say no. I think grains do too many things, too many damaging things. Number one, all grains have inflammatory ingredients, so you're going to create inflammation in the gut, which is never healthy for a horse. So I just don't see the benefit of adding grains. If you're going to add grains, I would add cleaned oats where the shells have been removed, the excess has been removed. Don't feed whole oats or whole wheat or whole barley because they're going to have the lectins and inflammation from that. I would get triple clean racehorse oats because that is giving you basically the juice. And I'm not really advocating that, but if you have to, that's where you go. Grains also dump a sugar load, which is going to cause a spike in insulin. And that insulin is going to shut down your fat cells. So they are not going to be able to supply the free fatty acids needed for the horse to compete. So you're blocking their primary source of fuel from being released from fat stores. So in your eyes, when you feed grain, the horse doesn't lose its fat because you prevented it from happening, which is really important if you want your horse to look good at the end of the race. Because if you don't feed grain and you just allow the horse to use fat, it's going to burn through the fat that it ate, and then it's going to go to the stored fat to use that. And so after 50 or 100 miles, your horse is going to lose a lot of body fat. And everyone's going to say, gosh, your horse lost condition. Oh my gosh, what kind of horse owner are you? Well, the body did exactly what it's supposed to do. It got stressed for 1 or 2 days, and it's going to consume the body fat. That's what it's there for. Now, 1,000 years ago, they didn't have grain stores hanging around. They might not have pasture. And if a horse was chased for 2, 3, 4 days, constantly moving, it would burn through its body fat and finally collapse and be eaten. I mean, that's what happens. They're run until they can't. It's just a race. You see this all the time in the Wild Kingdom type shows where they just run and run and run. Whoever can stay the longest wins. If the little animal can keep running and get away from the attacker, it does it. But a lot of these attackers just keep pacing and pacing and pacing and keeping them moving, keeping them moving, keeping them moving. And they starve to death at the cell level and they collapse and then they're eaten. That's just the way it is. So we don't want our horse to collapse and be eaten at the end of a race. We get that. But we also know that it's okay for them to lose some of their body fat. And the key here is if your horse is racing, standardbred, thoroughbred, endurance, competitive, whatever you want to call it. I'm I'm not really going to put sprinters in here. Sprinters like barrel racing, or, those horses that shoot out of the gate and they head and heel the calf. I mean, those guys are running for their lives and they're dipping into their glucose supply, no doubt about it. They're going to be able to replace that glucose lost by dipping into the starch of the pasture that they're on, and that will replace the glucose of the glycogen. They don't need to have added calories or added starch in the form of seeds. They don't need that. They will get there. If you race that horse, if you were a cutting horse and you're out there every day, day and night, 24 hours a day, yeah, you'll die. It goes back to those plowing horses. These men would take their plowing horses, and there was no organization out there looking out for these horses. They were worked. They were worked and worked and worked. They might have got 8 hours of sleep, but 16 hours they were worked. And so they had to add the sugars of the starch of the grains to maintain their body fat. And they were purposely trying to get their horses to keep working. And the only way they could do that was to add the sugar. And the sugar went into the glycogen and restored the glycogen. They were working so hard that they never had insulin resistance because they were burning all the glucose, or whatever was left over was stored as body fat, but they were still burning the glucose. And so the extra grain they had as workhorses was being consumed. But if you're just going to run your horse for 1 or 2 days and it burns through the glycogen, it will be restored during those days of rest. And I know you don't do 50 or 100-mile rides every weekend. Nobody does that. You give that horse that time to rest and recuperate and to restore the muscles back to where it was. I just got done with 12 weeks of a resistance band training, and I went from not really a lot of resistance to what I thought was pretty good. I got my heart rate up to 140 or something, 146 just yesterday. But I had to take almost 2 weeks off. I just shut down. I said, that's it. I'm done with this. And I didn't do any resistance band training for almost 2 weeks. And I just started again yesterday. And guess what? I went right back to, or maybe just under where I was 2 weeks ago. My strength hadn't diminished, but my tolerance for the exercise was back. I loved it. I look forward to it. I'm looking forward to going back this afternoon and doing some more. So that kind of rest is always needed, and we need that for our horses to keep the muscles growing, building, and restoring their intracellular components so that they're ready for the next race. And if you're feeding grain, you're not allowing that horse to convert back over to using body fat for the fuel, or the cellulose, the fat from the cellulose for fuel. So they're becoming more and more inflexible. And worse, if you don't exercise at all, then your body is not able to switch back and forth, and your muscles will actually shrink and your glycogen storage will diminish, which is something that's worse. And if you're adding grain to the diminishing place for it to go, there's a greater chance that it will go to the fat cells and add more fat to the fat cells. And you're actually going to add body fat rather than become the athlete that you're trying to do. One interesting point about these horses, there's something called Monday morning disease. We call it azoturia, tying up. Now they're talking about it as polysaccharide storage myopathy, whatever you want to call it. They even call it coffee color urine disease. These plow horses are being worked really hard. Well, the men, sorry, I doubt there are very many women out there plowing the fields, but the men would take Sunday off. That was the Sabbath. Everybody went to church and they didn't plow on the seventh day. That's just the way it was back in the 1800s, 1900s. But they would still feed the horse the same amount of grain that they would get if they were working that day. And they would feed that on Sunday. And on Monday morning, their horses would be stiff. They would be crampy. They would be tying up. It'd be so bad that some of them would start shaking with pain. They would go down. I've actually seen horses like this. They're so painful. It's the worst colic you've ever seen and has nothing to do with their guts. It's just cramping everywhere. And if you look at their urine, it goes from yellow to coffee color, that dark brown, reddish brown, dark color of coffee. And what's happening is the excess sugar on the day of rest actually promoted the breakdown of the muscle cells, and myoglobin was released. And myoglobin is a component of muscle cells that has to be excreted in the urine, and it creates this coffee color, and it also plugs the the sieve. It's like as you strain your vegetables over the sink, you pour your sink, and all the water goes through that really fine mesh. That's basically what your kidneys do. But this plugs up all those holes so nothing gets through. So you're pouring all the blood into the kidneys and nothing's getting out. And so the kidneys can't do the job of cleansing the blood. And the horse goes into disease, a very sick state, and dies from this tying up, this Monday morning syndrome. And this is another reason, proof in the pudding, if you will, that it's just not beneficial to add grain to any horse that's been working so hard, especially the next day when you've given them the day off because you worked so hard at the 100-mile race. You wouldn't want to be adding that grain. So I don't see any advantage of adding grain. And thankfully, there's some scientists over in, I believe it's Sweden, where standardbred racing is pretty popular, that have done experiments of racing their horses only on a forage diet without any grains at all. And the results that they're seeing is not only healthier horses, but no decrease in race times, no decrease in purses that they're earning. And I think this brilliant approach to no grain challenge is so beneficial. You again can look all this stuff up on your favorite search engine. I don't use the G word anymore. Sorry, I'm a techie, and there's better ways like DuckDuckGo or Swiss Cows. I know these are funny names, but they're great search engines. And you look for racehorses on no grain or something like that, and you'll see their studies. And I think it's pretty fascinating. We need to see more of this done. I'd love to see some endurance horse riders do this. And actually, I do. I have one really popular and very effective endurance rider who's part of the Facebook group. Shout out to Bruce. Thank you so much for being part of this, who's gone to the no grain challenge and added soybean meal. And he has found, like most people, that the recovery times are faster, that they're competing at highest level, they're winning at the highest level, and they're doing everything they can with happier horses and healthier horses by taking away the grain. And I think the endurance community here in America is starting to see that, and they're being like an ambassador to this. And again, I get $0 for telling people not to feed grain. I have no skin in the game. I just want the horses to be healthy and happy. And it's just warms my heart to know that there are people out there doing this. So kudos to Bruce and to all the people who are listening to him and following his path, and to other people who are listening to this podcast who want to try it and say, okay, I understand that grain is inflammatory. I understand that grain actually prevents the muscles from using the fuel that they prefer. And I understand that I don't want a beauty pageant as an athlete. I want an athlete as an athlete. I want to be able to take away the layers of fat and see muscle underneath it. I don't want to see the layers of fat go away and see a top line that doesn't work and suspensory ligaments that are breaking down. I want to have the materials necessary to build the horse. And I'm going to believe in the physics of horses of a long, slow distance, or what I like to call LSD, long, slow distance, to build up the tolerance, to build up the mitochondrial flexibility. And every horse is an individual. So I can't give you a cookie cutter approach that this is going to work on your horse or every horse out there. But I can almost guarantee that every horse out there is going to use fuel the same way. They're going to enjoy using fat for fuel. They're going to try to avoid using glucose unless the evidence is there that they need that. Like a racehorse running his race, a thoroughbred race, going as fast as can standardbred. And then at the end, I'm going to supply enough glucose to restore the glycogen storage. But every horse's glycogen storage is going to be different. And I have to know when that need is met and when I'm exceeding it. And if I'm exceeding it, the sure sign is that the horse maintains body fat, because the only way they can maintain body fat is you're feeding excess glucose in excess of their daily needs. So if you're training your horse and your horse doesn't look like Michael Phelps, a swimmer, low body fat and lots of muscles, then if he's got a lot of body fat, you're feeding glucose in excess. And you need to address that, because the more you keep the glucose down to their daily needs and replace the glucose that's lost during their competition or their training, the more you're going to have an athletic horse that's going to preserve its proteins, preserve its soft tissues, and have the fuels necessary to do what you're asking him to do. It's really that simple. So no, I'm not a fan of feeding any grains. But again, if you feel like you have to feed a grain, keep it as a dehulled grain, that you're only feeding the starch from it. Make sure that they don't need that excess. But if they do, that it's staying with a dehulled sort of grain. And racehorse oats have been used for centuries, and that seems to work really well. So that's about it about how to feed a horse that's in competition. I think you should start trying it. I'll never forget Melissa, who works with me. She said to me, she was doing 3-day eventing. And on the third day, when she was doing the cross country galloping, and she was riding when they still allowed helmet cams. And I love watching the ears of the horse prick forward and backwards, as they're coming up to and listening to the cues and doing the. And this horse is galloping, going down the course. And she said, Jeff, when I took my horse off grain, 2 things occurred. One, he would be in the starter's box, almost asleep. And people would walk by and they would comment, well, that horse isn't going to make it to the end of this race. And she would just smile and let him walk by, because she knew that when that, signal came, that horse is off like a bullet out of the gun, and he would run the whole race and get to the end of it. And when he did, he'd turn around and said, do you want to do that again? That's how much energy this horse had. And the recovery times of that horse, it would be like so fast that he'd be standing there breathing normally. And all these other horses were like snorting, huffing and puffing. They were just like still trying to get enough oxygen in, because they're still burning this crappy fuel called glucose. They hadn't been able to convert back over to fat, which is a much cleaner burning fuel with no free radicals, and gives twice as much energy per unit of measure. So she says, I'll never go back to grain, just based on the recovery times and how much of a willing partner I had. So the horse's brain was right and his fuel was right. And the horse would recover so fast and never got lame. So the evidence is there. You just have to trust the process and understand the process. And once you do, and if you're willing to give it a whirl, go ahead and do it, and then become a member of thehorsesadvocate.com and come here and tell your story for other people to see. Or if you don't want to do that, become a member of the Horses Advocate Facebook group. It's private. Once you get grant, and we get grant access to everybody, we also will boot you out if you're a jerk. But or if you're trying to promote some product. We'll try and keep it agenda free, but tell your story and let other people know. The more people who know about your recovery times, your ability to compete at high levels. We've got Kathy Veal, who is a big advocate. It took her months to learn and understand, and now she's competing dressage at the highest level, USDF gold medal in Grand Prix, and she is just the biggest fan of not feeding grain, feeding soybean meal. Her horse can compete now as a willing partner, as a focused partner, without any of this rigmarole. The horse was unrideable 2 years ago, and now she's the biggest ambassador for the no grain. So we've got inroads in the dressage world. We've got it in the endurance riding world. I'd love to see it. I've got some barrel racers that are also saying that they're seeing improved benefits from this. And the more of you out there talking about it, you don't have to say Dr. Tucker's diet. I'm not here for the glory. I'm here for the horse. So if you can just say the no grain diet, just get out there and bring people over here to understand it. Go into the Horse Advocate on the free side and see all the blogs. Log in and become a member of the Horse Advocate, and you can have access to the schools, the nutrition course, the forums, ask your questions, dig down deep. I think between you and me, we can actually change the horse world. And that's what my goal is. to help horses thrive in the human world and to fill in all the missing pieces of the horse owner's manual. So this is Doc T. Thanks again for staying here. I love you all. I appreciate you all. And I look forward to talking to you next week. Bye. Hey everyone, Doc T here. Thank you for listening to my content. Would you do me a huge favor? Would you please subscribe, comment, like, thumbs up, and give a star review? However it's presented to you, I want you to do that. There's two reasons. The first, of course, is to improve this product. This way I know what you like, what you don't like, what I can improve upon, what topics you want me to cover. But more importantly, it's also going to help others find me. And by doing that, you are now engaged in this mission of helping horses thrive in a human world. By you helping, we can reach others. And that I would be so grateful for. And remember, go to thehorsesadvocate.com for updates on this information. Thehorsesadvocate.com. And again, thank you so much for being here. Doc T out.